Our next presenter, John S. Thompson. He is now employed, happy to research and write full-time for Scripture Central. John Thompson obtained his BA and MA in Ancient and Eastern Studies, Hebrew Bible, from BYU and the University of Berkeley, respectively, and completed a PhD in Egyptology at the University of Pennsylvania. He was an employee of the Seminaries and Institutes of Religion for 28 years, most recently as a coordinator and the Institute Director in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he researches and writes on the Book of Abraham. His topic today is Sons and Fathers, Abraham's Family, and the Two Altars of the Temple.
It is certainly a truism that how a particular culture perceives life, death, the world, and their place in it, in other words, their worldview, may change over time for all kinds of reasons. But generally speaking, temples and texts can and often do help a culture's foundational ideas to remain static for centuries. Internal and even cross-cultural comparisons of temples and texts can help identify these consistencies. For example, comparing the basic outline of the Israelite temple and the Exodus narrative is a good example of an internal appraisal. The progression, sorry, Jeff. Yeah, I'm not getting to the next slide here. Thanks. The progression of the Exodus, moving from the bottom to the top of this diagram, features Israel being released from bondage via sacrifice, moving through an initial journey featuring the Red Sea and washing at the base of Mount Sinai, ascending Mount Sinai and having a feast, making another sacrifice, going on a secondary journey, but this time carrying a temple and priesthood and higher laws of holiness, and then ritually crossing the Jordan to enter their promised land. These steps have much in common with the architectural progression of the temple. Some might conclude the temple is codifying the Exodus or vice versa, an argument of causation, but the possibility that they are both simply reflecting a shared worldview is just as real, an argument of correlation. The corollary themes of divine deliverance, sustenance, and commandments found in both the Exodus and in the temple reflect their culture's general understanding of God's helps and expectations for a soul desiring to move through mortality and enter his presence. Likewise, this study compares the collective narratives of the patriarch Abraham to the sequential framework of the temple in order to highlight two grand and progressive moments in the Israelite religion that appear in texts, architecture, and even art for centuries. I say collective narrative because the commonalities with the temple are not readily apparent in the Bible alone, but become more apparent when one considers the extra-biblical sources that include the early life of Abraham. So similar to David's earlier work that he presented. While including this extra material goes beyond the typical controls of analyzing the purpose of any single text like Genesis, including the material from Abraham's early life causes the story of Abraham to not only reflect better the temple, but also narrative patterns or type scenes, as Robert Alter called them, that can be seen in the stories of Isaac and Jacob, which follow. While the story of Abraham and Sarah is full of many tests and sacrifices, two principal moments of sacrifice appear in the collective narrative of Abraham's life. The sacrifice that he makes as a son in his early years, and the sacrifice he makes as a father in his later years. Two sacrifices, first as a son, and then later as a father, appear as a type scene or as type scenes in the narratives of Isaac and Jacob as well. Details in the text and other cultural signals suggest that these two sacrificial moments can be correlated with the two principal altars of the temple, the altar of sacrifice outside the temple in the courtyard, and the altar of incense inside the temple. Admittedly, the altar of incense's reflection in these narratives is not easily apparent, since on the surface, the details more readily reflect blood sacrifices given at the courtyard altar. However, there are some literary and artistic clues that suggest more is going on, as will be noted. Further, much of what occurs inside the temple is meant to be an amplified repetition of what already occurred in the courtyard, outside the temple. For example, the simple garments of the priest in the courtyard anticipate the more elaborate high priestly garment inside the temple. The simple meal of the courtyard becomes the grander feast represented by the table of showbread inside the temple. The bronze decor of the courtyard becomes gold inside the temple. Likewise, the interior altar of incense is likely meant to be an amplified reflection of the altar of sacrifice in the courtyard. Both are altars, after all. Both suggest a sacrifice is being given of some nature. Both have similar features, such as square shape and decorative horns. Both their proximity to the presence of but their proximity to the presence of God is different, and the nature of their sacrifices are different, suggesting a progression is at play. As will hopefully become clearer through this analysis, the same sacrificial moment in the patriarchal narratives can simultaneously represent both altars of the temple, the two different points along the path of the Israelite worldview, depending on whose perspective the reader is considering, the son's or the father's. The son's role in the narrative reflects better the altar in the courtyard, but the father's participation in the same moment reflects better the altar inside the temple. For each patriarch, the first altar is a sacrifice of self as son. The second altar is a sacrifice as father of all that one loves in order to fulfill greater divine purposes, trusting that in neither case will the soul be truly left bereft in the end. We've seen this before, but a 16th century Persian or Ottoman time period miniature representing the life of Abraham includes these two principal moments of sacrifice. The first sacrifice, depicted in the lower portion of the image, reflects the extra-biblical tradition of Abraham's early life, wherein he found himself nearly sacrificed by fire because he opposed the idolatry of his fathers and the ruler Nimrod in this example. The second sacrifice, depicted in the upper portion of this image and narrated in Genesis 22, is when God asks Abraham to sacrifice his own son, Ishmael, in this example, by fire on an altar in the later years of his life. Though both are depictions of sons being sacrificed, from Abraham's perspective, these two moments are quite different. The first was a sacrifice of self in defending the kingdom of God, and the second was a sacrifice of his beloved son. That the first sacrifice is depicted at the base of a mountain and nearby tower, while the second sacrifice is in a mountain, may be artistic signals that these moments reflected the courtyard altar and the temple altar, respectively. Similar signals can be seen in the extra-biblical stories of Abraham being sacrificed in his early years, provided by Joseph Smith, wherein the reader is told that the altar of his demise stood by the hill called Potiphar's Hill, at the head of the plain of Olishem. In other traditions, Abraham was to be burned in a fiery furnace next to a tower from whence the ruler looks down upon him. In contrast to his initial near sacrifice by a hill or tower, Abraham's later near sacrifice of his own son Isaac, as recounted in Genesis, has God telling Abraham to get thee into the land of Moriah and offer thy son there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. An altar on a plain by the hill versus an altar upon one of the mountains raises the possibility that these two moments, from Abraham's perspective, are as a son and then as a father, reflect the sacrificial altar of the courtyard next to temples and the incense altar inside of temples, respectively. From Isaac's perspective, though his demise was Abraham's mountain, for him, it was the initial sacrifice of the courtyard, as will be discussed. The extra canonical material concerning Abraham's early life reveal that Abraham's father and immediate ancestors had turned to their idolatry of the state religion in Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham actively opposed this by refusing to bow down to their idols and even destroying them. For his defiance, Abraham was surrendered by his father to the ruler. Quote, one of the sources indicates that we may be delivered from this evil, end quote. And he was sentenced to death. It is an important detail to note that Abraham's own father was implicated in the death of his son, for this is part of the narrative pattern or type scene that will unfold. Abraham's defiance of a state-sponsored religion, and thus its ruler, who would have been considered its high priest, would be treasonous, thus making his execution a form of capital punishment. Many traditions state that Abraham's sacrificial fate was to be cast or even catapulted into a fiery furnace by Nimrod, the chief ruler over the land of Shinar, which included the city of Ur. The book of Abraham indicates that it was the priests, plural, of the local cult who laid violence upon Abraham that they might slay him, because Abraham, like others before him, would not bow down to the idols of wood, their idols of wood and stone. This local priesthood appears to be serving in some sort of syncretic religion, comprising local gods as well as the god of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Some of their rituals were even done after the manner of the Egyptians. A religion of Chaldea having Egyptian influences seems unlikely, since Nimrod and his kingdom of Shinar are typically associated with southern Mesopotamia, where Egyptian influence was limited and unlikely to have influenced their local religion. However, a growing body of evidence suggests that Abraham, Nimrod, Shinar, and the Chaldeans were in northern Mesopotamia, not southern. We've heard this already, but Gary Rinsberg will outline this in greater detail later today, actually. This is important for us because there is also a growing body of evidence that Egyptian influence in northern Mesopotamia was significant during Abraham's day, which John Gee will address more next week. As noted above, the altar of Abraham's demise was by the hill called Potiphar's Hill. That this hill could be a man-made temple is supported by ancient Christian traditions concerning Abraham's opposition to the false religions of his day. One states, "And hills were made, and God thrust down into them the demons who lived in the images and in the idols. For those hills were made for the idols, and in them they were destroyed." That the hill was named Potiphar, Egyptian Padi Pa-Re, meaning the one that the Re has given, suggests that this hill in Ur also served the foreign sun god Re. Remarkably, though the meaning of the name Potiphar could not have been known in Joseph Smith's day, the Book of Abraham affirms that this hill was indeed for a solar cult purpose. It states, Book of Abraham does, "And it came to pass that the priest made an offering unto the god of Pharaoh and unto the god of Shagrael, even after the manner of the Egyptians. Now the god of Shagrael was the sun." Again, the evidence points to a syncretic religion in this context, including a local solar god, Shagrael, and the foreign solar god, Re. A sacred hill or temple of a solar cult with a name like Padi Pa-Re echoes nicely some sun temples in Egypt that are a couple hundred years prior to Abraham's day that also were named with a theophoric element of Re. So the one you're seeing on the outline that you're seeing on the screen was titled Shesep Yibre, which literally means the joy of the heart or the delight of Re. And this sun temple remains are still there, and that's me laying on the altar that's outside or next to the hill of that temple. And then the little square in the upper left-hand corner is if you look around the four corners of the altar, four sides of the altar are shaped with a hetep symbol, which literally means in Egyptian hieroglyphics, offering. Many other sun temples of this time period all have the name Re. So there's Nekhen Re, a sun temple meaning the fortress of Re, Seket Re, the field of Re, Seteb Yibre, or Set Yibre, the favorite place of Re, and so on. And interestingly, what we have in the book of Abraham is Padi Pa Re. Right? Although I'm not trying to suggest that these Egyptian temples that are a couple hundred years prior to Abraham's day is what was being built in Ur of the Chaldees, but it is simply an interesting point to bring to bear in this moment that we have a solar cult and a hill that has a similar theophoric name that we find in ancient Egypt. So what to make of that from an actual historical point of view, it's hard to say. The name Potiphar, or Padi Pare, is a form that is anachronistic to the Egyptian Old Kingdom and to Abraham's day, just as it is in the Genesis story of Joseph's time period. You would not have a name Padi Pare because this structure of that name is a very late period structure, but we can easily explain this as an updating of the name as a convention of translation over time. And since the book of Abraham dates to probably, as we're hearing, could be dated to a Greco-Roman time period, then Potiphar would exist in that time period. Okay. From the priest's perspective, Abraham was likely viewed as a force of chaos and sedition, an evildoer that needed to be overcome through the divine power invested in the ruler and his priestly officiants. In this regard, broadly speaking, Abraham's capital punishment on a pagan altar would have functioned similarly to the death of animals on an Israelite courtyard altar, a means for ridding people and the land of evil and restoring order. Abraham's willingness to surrender his life, defending God, the God he worshipped, appears to have been a pivotal yet preparatory moment for Abraham's higher covenantal relationship and symbolic ascent to God. That some view it as a preparatory for greater blessings is seen in a Muslim tradition wherein Gabriel clothes Abraham with garments from paradise and brings him a golden throne immediately after he was spared from the sacrificial fire. This detail again places Abraham's sacrifice in a temple context, preceding a divine robing and ascent. In the book of Abraham, the great angel sent to deliver him from his executioners exclaims that his pleas have not gone unnoticed and that future tense responsibilities and blessings were coming. Abraham, Abraham, my name is Jehovah, and I have heard thee, and I've come down to deliver thee. I've come down to visit them and to destroy him who has lifted up his hand against thee. Abraham, my son, to take away thy life. Behold, I will lead thee by my hand, and I will take thee to put upon thee my name, even the priesthood of thy father, and my power shall be over thee. As it was with Noah, so shall it be with thee. But through thy ministry, my name shall be known in the earth forever, for I am God. Note Jehovah's emphasis on Abraham as a son in this moment, through such phrases as to take thee away from thy father's house, or my son, and to put upon thee my name, even the priesthood of thy father. This, as will be seen, stands in contrast to the later formalization of Abraham and God's covenant relationship, wherein Abraham is referenced repeatedly as father. As Nibley noted, many of the traditions concerning Abraham's near sacrifice indicate that in the end, someone else dies in his place. Usually it was his executioner who dies, just as in the book of Abraham. Since the sacrifices of the courtyard altar were vicarious or a substitute for the one who's supposed to be sacrificed, substitution in the narratives of the patriarchs becomes another interesting point of comparison. Like the narrative of Abraham, the story cycle of Isaac begins with his own near sacrifice on an altar at the hand of his father. While the sacrifice of Isaac has deep differences to the sacrifice of Abraham, for example, the wickedness of Terah as father compared to the righteousness of Abraham as father, these differences do not nullify the type seen as pattern. Rather, such differences, again, as Robert Alter noted, provide narrative tensions that can convey principles or ideas the writer wants the reader to consider. That Isaac's sacrifice as a son reflects the courtyard is made clear in the text which states that all the preparations and declared intent for his sacrifice were to be made as a burnt offering at an altar. And the fact that they bring wood and they have fire and a knife. And the idea that it's a knife and a fire, can make sense of the Abrahamic tradition, where in the book of Abraham, it's a knife, but in the other traditions, Abraham's being burned. Well, in a burnt offering, you do both of those things. So that could be a reason for those discrepancies. As in the Abraham story, Genesis 22 makes clear that Isaac is a son in this moment. And God said, "Take now thy son." And Abraham took Isaac, his son. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid upon Isaac, his son. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering." And Abraham, I'm skipping around obviously, but Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac, his son. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. This near sacrifice of Isaac is preceded in the narrative by Abraham and Abimelech making covenant oaths at Beersheba, and by the narrative of Ishmael, Abraham's first birthright heir, and the first to be nearly sacrificed by Abraham when he sends Ishmael out into the wilderness at the behest of both Sarah and God. Ironically, Isaac becomes the legal replacement for his estranged brother, but by so doing becomes Ishmael's substitute on the altar, since all firstborn were to be given to God. The chosen seed sparing the life of the estranged seed is a theme worth pondering. Fortunately, a ram is provided and Isaac is saved from the altar by a substitute as well. Isaac's sons Esau and Jacob are also portrayed as sons who are sacrificed, though it is less obvious in the narrative. Rabbis noted long ago that Rebekah's request that Jacob bring her 2 kids of the goats and her 2 sons being identified as goats. Esau is described as hairy, which in Hebrew, Sa'ir, also means goat, and Jacob is clothed in the skins of the goat. So the hairiness of Esau, the goat skin, and the fact that Rebekah says to bring the meat of 2 goats, or the 2 kids of goats, rabbis stated that this appears to foreshadow the 2 goats of the Day of Atonement. The required rituals of this holy day were to offer up in the courtyard 1 goat to the Lord as a sin offering, and the other goat is symbolically laden with the sins of the people and driven out into the wilderness. Though his firstborn and beloved son, Isaac severed Esau, like Abraham severed Ishmael before him from the family birthright, and blessings in deference to desires of their wives. His severance echoes the goat that is cast out into the wilderness, whereas Jacob, the legal substitute, becomes the sacrificial goat for the Lord, symbolized by his offering the goat meat to his father. The goat meat that Jacob presents to Isaac is the substitute for Jacob himself, as the ram was for Isaac. Connecting this story to the temple and courtyard sacrifice of atonement causes the goodly raiment that Rebekah took from Esau and put upon Jacob to take on the meaning of a priestly authority similar to the Lord's promise to put upon Abraham the priesthood at the altar of his sacrifice. Jacob's offering is accepted by Isaac, who blesses him. The brief dialogue between Jacob and Isaac emphasizes strongly Jacob's role as a son in this moment. And Jacob came unto his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here am I. Who art thou, my son?" And Jacob said unto his father, "I am Esau, thy firstborn." And Isaac said unto him, Isaac said unto his son, "How is it that thou hast found it so quickly, my son?" And Isaac said unto Jacob, "Come near, I pray thee, that I may feel thee, my son, whether thou be my very son, Esau, or not." And Jacob went near unto Isaac his father, and he said, "Art thou not my very son, Esau?" And he said, I am. And he said, bring it near to me, and I will eat of my son's venison. And his father Isaac said unto him, come near now and kiss me, my son. See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field which the Lord hath blessed. In addition to Jacob's symbolic connection to a courtyard sacrifice, the narrative anticipates Jacob's later ascent by emphasizing his eventual rulership over his brother and others. Let people serve thee, and nations bow down to thee. Be Lord over thy brethren, and let thy mother's son bow down to thee. Jacob's son Joseph also fits the type scene of a son who was sacrificed. Like the previous stories, the firstborn of the entire family, Reuben, was severed from his birthright. Joseph becomes his substitute and is symbolically sacrificed, like Jacob before him, via a special garment and the kid of a goat. Recall that after selling Joseph into slavery, his brothers take his special coat and immerse it in the blood of a kid of a goat that they slaughtered. The Hebrew word there is the same word for sacrificial killing. And then offered it to Jacob, who thinks his son Joseph had perished. The goat is Joseph's substitute in this moment. The dialogue between Jacob and his sons focuses on the identification of Joseph as son. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father. And they said, this have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. And he knew it, and he said, it is my son's coat. And Jacob rent his clothes and mourned for his son many days. I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. So his father wept for him. In sum, the literary and artistic placement of the patriarchs as sons who become blood sacrifices as a precursor to their ascent allows one to view these moments as similar to the sacrifices of temple courtyards prior to the reception of priesthood or entering the temple or mountain of the Lord's house. This moment suggests a worldview wherein one is expected to begin their life's journey with a commitment to sacrifice their own desires and follow God's commandments, and even to die for his cause if need be, as Abraham demonstrated. A Jewish tradition concerning Abraham's early life declares, for the sake of heaven, Abraham was willing to give up his life in the fire, the Ur of the Chaldees. And whenever a man is willing to give up his life for the sake of heaven, he is given back not only his life in this world, but full and long life, endless life in the world to come. God blessed Abraham for his willing sacrifice as a son. But Abraham's journey was not complete. There was a greater sacrifice, greater instruction, and greater blessings to come. And so I'll try to be brief with this last segment here. Oop. Sorry, Jeff, we're not moving forward again. Closely following his own initial sacrifice as a son, the next segment of the Abraham narratives focus on his formal entrance into the covenant with God. In this setting, God emphasizes Abraham's role as father. He is no longer addressed as son, and the promise of seed is a central blessing. The covenant's deep connection to parenthood likely explains Abraham's marriage to Sarah appearing in the same context as those passages outlining the covenant and its promises. In addition to Abraham entering into the covenant, Abraham receives his divine cosmic panoramic instruction. And we get the concept that we've heard earlier today about Abraham looking to the stars. And the book of Abraham, of course, gives us a bigger cosmic view where he sees premortality all the way through all the redemption of the world and the creation, etc. And so these two concepts, covenant and cosmic instruction, I think show up after you enter into the temple. You've sacrificed yourself on the altar. You go into the temple, and then you have a table of showbread, and you have a menorah. And there's a lot of scholarship about the menorah representing. It's actually in the Bible too, that it represented the heavenly bodies, the stars of the heavens, and the table would represent easily, covenant meals that took place in the ancient Near East. After you entered into a relationship with somebody else, you sat down with them and you partook. In addition to covenant and cosmic instruction, the text emphasizes Abraham and Sarah's faithfulness through various trials and tests to see if they are willing to sacrifice all things, which we'll hear from the Seelies, even the things they love the most, to maintain the covenant and their relationship with God. Such a sacrifice is distinct from a surrender of self and cleansing that the courtyard altar provides. It is a consecration of all things to God. God asked Abraham to sacrifice his own son Isaac. Asking him to sacrifice his own son Isaac seems to be the ultimate test in the narrative. As Levinson so masterfully argued, sacrificing one's firstborn is a central tenet in the Israelite laws and narratives, though they could be redeemed from their fate via substitution. Prior to the sacrifice of Isaac as Sarah's firstborn, it should be noted that it was very grievous for Abraham to give Ishmael, his firstborn son, to the wilderness, where death certainly awaited him, were it not for God's assurances otherwise. There appears to have been an unseen divine purpose to the sacrifice of Ishmael and a promise of preservation that engendered Abraham's faith to comply. Although it was counterintuitive to preserving the covenant, since the promised seed was threatened with destruction, Abraham's willingness to consecrate Isaac to God in the end actually assures his seed as well as his covenant relationship with God, who their bond and blessing was made sure through an unbreakable oath that God swore to him in Genesis 22 after his willingness to sacrifice Isaac. The Christian view of this moment likens Abraham's receipt of the oath to a person passing like a high priest through the veil into the Holy of Holies of the temple in Hebrews chapter 6. That this oath is connected to the veil logically connects the sacrifice of Isaac, the final offering made before the oath, to the altar before the veil, the altar of incense. This tracks well with Abraham being told that the sacrifice of his son was to be made upon a mountain, as noted earlier. Censing in the ancient world is often characterized by burning incense in cups or pots held in the hand. Censers in the shape of open hands holding a cup are attested archaeologically, so you have one there. In Christianity, the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints ascended before God from the angel's hand, according to the book of Revelation. That the hand itself is often included in the iconography or mentioned in the text suggests its presence is important to the rite. The word consecration means to make something holy, to dedicate it to God, and is often translated from a combination of two Hebrew words, mala, fill, and yad, hand. Filling the hand alludes to priestly offerings that are presented like incense in the hand. Incense was a particularly useful symbol of indicating something was dedicated to God or holy. The smoke or cloud provided an impression of the divine smell or presence that covered all that was in it. In Genesis 22, Abraham called the place of Isaac's sacrifice where God provided a substitute ram. I'm going to skip this part. So after his own near sacrifice as a son, Isaac's narrative moves next to his marriage to Rebekah. The birth of their two boys and Isaac's formal entrance into the covenant with God, also similar to Abraham's narrative. The focus of the covenant language is on Isaac as father. And then also Isaac is told to look at the stars of the heavens. And we do have apocryphal literature such as the Testament of Isaac talking about how Isaac also was taken into heaven and hell. So he gets his divine instruction as well. And then true to the type scene of the second sacrifice, Isaac and Rebekah must also consecrate their all within the covenant. Much in the narrative is just a repetition of what Abraham and Sarah did before. Like Abraham and Sarah, Isaac appears to cut off his firstborn son Esau from the blessings in harmony with the desires of his wife, and presumably God, though that is not explicit in this story, and receives his son Jacob, the supplanter, as a substitute sacrifice, as outlined before. Within the narrative depictions of their faithfulness, Isaac went up from thence to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared unto him the same night and said unto him, I am the God of Abraham thy father. Fear not, for I am with thee, and will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake. After Jacob's symbolic sacrifice as a son, he grows to become a father whose choice son is sacrificed as well. Jacob seeks a wife and has a vision of a ladder in connection with entering into the covenant of God. The ladder reaching into heaven is likely a representation of the divine instruction given in connection with the covenant as outlined in the stories of Abraham and Isaac. Jacob calls the ladder the gate of heaven and names the place Bethel. Like Abraham and Isaac, Jacob must prove his faithfulness through greater sacrifices of the things that he loves. Jacob's wrestling with and prevailing over the angel may represent his striving to endure. As before in such context, the promise of the covenant is that Jacob would be a father with seed. But like Abraham and Isaac, Jacob cuts off his firstborn son Reuben, and the legal substitute Joseph is sacrificed so God can fulfill his purposes for the family as a whole. Jacob is even required in the twilight of his life to surrender Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, who has become who's become the substitute for Joseph in Jacob's eyes. Jacob is convinced that he must potentially surrender Benjamin's life so that all the others might live. Judah, now changed, demonstrates his willingness to be Benjamin's substitute when things do not go well. So, what might these correlations reveal about the Israelite worldview? Right, Jeff, one more. The type seen of the patriarchs' early years is that they are sons who become sacrifices with respect to their fathers. But each son is saved from the death of their first sacrifice, whether real or symbolic, and progress to make an even greater sacrifice. Each becomes a father who must cut off a son, often for the sake of righteousness, while the legal substitute is sacrificed in various ways to fulfill the purposes of God. Each father learns to consecrate all that they love or have to God, no matter the immediate cost. They trust that God will see their sacrifices and make everything all right. But the stories go beyond just the sparing of the sacrificed son. The effect of each son's willingness and each father's faithfulness is that all the estranged children are reconciled back to the family as well. In the later part of Jacob and Esau's narrative, they are reunited and reconciled. The reconciliation for Jacob is so meaningful that he likens seeing the face of his brother to seeing the face of God. Therefore, I have seen thy face, and as though I had seen the face of God, and thou was pleased with me. Jacob, the one who was symbolically sacrificed, ends up being blessed with abundance and is able to share his bounty with Esau. While the narrative provides nothing explicit, Isaac and Ishmael appear to be reconciled as well. Both are considered Abraham's seed later in their lives, and although it was the sole legal responsibility of the birthright son to arrange for the burial of the family patriarch, the text simply indicates that both Isaac and Ishmael buried their father, providing literary evidence of their reunion. As in the stories of Isaac and Jacob, Joseph, the sacrificed one, as you know, is eventually reconciled to all of his brothers and gives the abundance that he's obtained as a ruler of Egypt to them. The first step of the patriarchs was to willingly sacrifice themselves as sons to fulfill in some way God's will. A willingness to consecrate all things, including one's own son, for God's purposes appears to represent the final step along the soul's journey to secure his blessings. To secure his blessings. Such can seem extremely harsh and even lays the foundation for radicalized thinking as child sacrifice becomes a thing in the ancient world. However, these two sacrifices correlate with the two altars of the temple and speak to the relationship the Israelites believed one must have with God as they draw closer to him. I guess there was one more. So what do these correlations reveal? One must be willing to give their own life, to surrender their own desires that are not in harmony with God's. And two, one must be willing to enter into and maintain a covenant relationship with God, even if doing so causes pain to those who love that we love the most. Again, some may question a God that requires such things, but those who trust that God will never ask one to do things that are not good or important in the long run, and who completely surrender to his will, are repeatedly rewarded with abundance and with a greater reconciliation and recompense than hoped. None are ever truly lost or harmed in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was fascinating. We have 3 questions, one of which I'm excited to hear your answer on. Number 1, can you give an opinion as to why modern temples in the Restoration have consolidated the 2 altars into one?
Well, it depends on which temple you go to, I think. Because some of the temples you move from room to room and there's different altars in each of the rooms. I think it's just a feature of convenience. I don't think that the one altar in some of our temples is meant to only be a single altar. In other words, I think it represents a courtyard altar at one point in the endowment, and then it represents the altar inside the temple later in the endowment.
Great, and here's the question I've always wanted to hear you answer. Have you done a meta-investigation of all known altars at Adam Ondi Amen? There appears to be at least 4. Number 1, the altar of sacrifice on Spring Hill. Number 2, the altar of prayer near Tower Hill. Number 3, the tiered priesthood altar resembling the Kirtland temple pulpits. And number 4, a possible Nephite altar. I'm curious whether these form a typological or symbolic sequence in light of the temple patterns like the one you've shown in Abraham.
I really don't know. Yeah, so that's an interesting idea. So,
and finally, in the Abrahamic pattern, we see 2 altars, one where the son is sacrificed and the other where the father offers the son. The son acts under the father's direction, but the father doesn't act alone either. So who is directing the father to offer the son?
well, it's interesting because, I mean, in the story of Abraham, it's obviously God who's acting or is telling him to sacrifice Isaac. In some of the other stories, you don't have that much of a direct command from God. And, you know, even in the story of Jacob and Esau, of course, it seems to be their mother who's orchestrating this event. So it's interesting that we do have women kind of engaged in this process of fathers sacrificing their sons symbolically in some of the narratives. But the mothers are acting in a way that seems to be in accordance with God's will because that's what happens. And so I think that's pretty much it. That only in the case of Abraham do we have an actual direct direction from the Lord, but in the other ones it seems to be a little less clear.
Great, thank you. Can't read the full account of these papers in the publication. We're now